Remembering Auschwitz, survivors revisit a painful past and share their stories in the hope that history doesn't repeat itself. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Dignitaries joined former prisoners of the notorious Auschwitz extermination camp on Monday, marking 75 years since its liberation. The memorial in Poland is considered the most infamous symbol of the Holocaust perpetrated by Nazi Germany against some 6 million European Jews. Those who survived it have tried to educate successive generations about genocide, but for some, the resurgence of right-wing populism across the world has familiar and worrying echoes. CGTN's Owen Fairclough reports, and a word of warning, you may find some of these images disturbing.
Everything was taken away from me.
I told myself, what is there to live for, even if the war is over?
I won against all odds. I am here, look at me, I am here.
75 years later, they're among the last remaining survivors of the Auschwitz extermination camp complex in Poland, telling their stories to ensure future generations never forget what they suffered. Nazi Germany and its anti-Semitic collaborators murdered some 6 million European Jews during the Second World War. Auschwitz, whose gates declared with barbaric irony, Arbeit macht frei, or work makes you free, was the largest extermination camp and remains the most infamous symbol of the Holocaust, not least for those willing to relive the horror.
When the doors opened, we felt like we were entering the gates of hell. There was smoke everywhere. There were awful smells. We could see bodies along the central alleyway. There were dogs running around, jumping on people who looked like walking skeletons.
Extermination was the fate of all who were not fit to be active beasts of burden for the Reich.
More than 1 million people died at Auschwitz alone, including non-Jews. Many gassed and then incinerated in enormous crematoriums, or simply shot dead and thrown into mass graves. When Russian soldiers liberated the camp and its sub-camps, the full horror of what had taken place wasn't immediately apparent, nor to the prisoners initially.
The worst of all was when we heard rumors, when we asked, why don't we see anyone from our family who were separated from us by the Germans that day when we arrived? And then we knew the truth. We were told, don't you see the smoke rising up? What could we think? Maybe it's from the kitchen, maybe from the laundry place. We couldn't even think for a moment on crematoriums.
After liberation, a museum was created in 1947, the huge site preserved to bear witness to the Holocaust. Those who survived the Holocaust settled all over the world, and their memories and evidence of what happened are preserved at memorials like this one in Washington, D.C. But they're also memorials to more recent genocides in places like Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cambodia, or Rwanda. But efforts to educate successive generations about the Holocaust haven't prevented far-right populist parties from becoming electable around Europe and even in Germany.
We want all the black out of this country. All Arab all what is Islam out.
For those who survived the Holocaust, those sentiments sound all too familiar.
Antisemitism is a problem that the world has to live with. I'm used to it. It's part of my functioning. That is there in the background all the time. Some of it very much within me. When somewhere else, I said, Auschwitz isn't gone. I'm still, part of me is still in Auschwitz.
Their hope is that part of Auschwitz will also remain, with those willing to see for themselves what happened there. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
Well, to talk more now about the liberation and legacy of Auschwitz, let's bring in our panel. Joining us here in Washington, Michael Brenner is Abbason Chair and Director of the Center for Israel Studies at American University. He has a personal connection to Auschwitz. Both his parents were sent there. Evan Bernstein is Vice President, Northeast Division of the Anti-Defamation League. He joins us from New York. Annika is an Associate Professor of History and International Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. And joining us via Skype from Milton Keynes in the United Kingdom, Anna Scanlon is an author and historian of Holocaust studies. Members of her family on the Polish side were prisoners at Auschwitz. Welcome to all of you to the show. Anna Scanlon, let me start with you. There was a commemoration service at Auschwitz on Monday. We heard from one of the survivors of the concentration camp. Her name is Batsheva Dagan. Let's listen.
I would not have recognized myself had it not been for the buildings having tall windows. I put my hands up, and that's when I recognized myself, that it was me. And the worst thing that I survived at the beginning, because it was difficult for me to say what caused me greater pain, the prisoner number tattoo on my arm or something else.
So, Anna, on this day, 75 years later, 75 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, what are your thoughts and feelings?
I think it's amazing that we're able to come together 75 years later, but it is a bit of a bittersweet thing, because now, as you said in the beginning of this segment, that there is quite a rise in anti-Semitism and racism and every kind of ism that there is. So in a way, it brings kind of a light to what's going on in terms of that, but it also helps commemorate the triumph of the victims over their perpetrators.
Anna, one other point, the number of people who survived the Holocaust, that number's dwindling. There are not many of them left. And I was wondering, once they have passed on, how much more of a challenge would it be to keep the story of the Holocaust alive?
I think it is quite a challenge, but people are working together to make sure that their stories never perish. I think a lot of people have begun to talk about the Holocaust in their old age. A lot of people were silent most of their lives. So you have people who are now just beginning to tell their stories that we're able to write down. And there are people working with technology and education and with books and everything to try to record as many of those as possible. So I think it will be a challenge, because we're going to be, maybe the generation below me will be the last generation to hear someone speaking about it live. But I think there are many of us that are going to try to make sure that the stories will continue on.
Michael, you are a historian. You had family in Auschwitz. You lost some of those family members, but some survived, your mother included. Tell us about what they told you, their experiences.
Right. My mother was not in Auschwitz. My mother was a slave laborer in Germany under the Nazis wearing the yellow star. My father was in camps that belonged to the Auschwitz concentration system, and my grandmother was killed there. For my father, it was very hard to talk for not just years, but decades after the war. And I think that was the typical experience for many survivors, that it was not easy for them to talk. But my mother is still alive. She's 95, and although not having been in Auschwitz, she has experienced the Nazi regime.
We have a picture on the screen right now, yeah.
And this actually is a picture right before she had to wear the yellow star, not this one, but when she was a little older. And as she got older, she talked more. She actually made it her mission to go to schools, to talk to students in Germany. She's now 95, and until last year she still did that, and she's a little too weak now. And I think for many of these survivors, it took maybe 50 years to cope with this, to be able to speak, but then they made it their life mission to not to forget.
And did she tell you anything about the response she got when she talked with students around the world, or people around the world, yeah?
Oh, yes, and sometimes I was able to come with her, and she always loves to talk to young people, because young people, and now I'm talking about Germany, they were not guilty. They grew up maybe in families who had to cope with the other side, with guilt. And she always thought it would be very important to talk to the young generation. She grew up in Dresden, and that happens to be now also one of the centers of the new far right in Germany. Yeah. But whenever she talks to young people, she has a good experience.
All right, let's go to Evan in New York. Evan, the Polish president, Andrzej Duda. He was speaking at a commemoration ceremony in Poland. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Distorting the history of the Second World War, denying the crimes of genocide and the Holocaust, as well as an instrumental use of Auschwitz to attain any given goal, is tantamount to desecration of the memory of the victims whose ashes are scattered here. The truth about the Holocaust must not die. The memory of Auschwitz must last so that such extermination is never repeated again.
So, Evan, how important is it to keep the memories of the Holocaust alive and never forgotten, especially at a time when we're seeing the re-emergence of anti-Semitism around the world?
I think it's critical. I think it's critical that the stories of these survivors are captured the way they have been, because as you know, is known, these survivors are passing away as fast, as fast as time is taking them. And I think the challenge is, as the survivors are gone, it's critical that we are able to tell those stories. You know, my mom was an educator in teaching the Holocaust in middle schools, and a lot of times that was the only touch point that a lot of students ever had on the Holocaust. I think as Jews, we sometimes live in an echo chamber where we're constantly surrounded by the Holocaust. I was around survivors, my family experienced the Holocaust, survived because of righteous Christians. But to the average American, an average person, the Holocaust may be something they saw in a movie or something they maybe were taught in school with some other subject as well. So I think it's important that we understand the importance of this ongoing education, because as it gets farther and farther away from the Holocaust, it's important. If you look at the claims conference numbers of people that were able to, even Jews were not able to say exactly what Auschwitz was or how many people passed away and perished in the Holocaust. And I think that's showing as time is going by, it's going to become harder and harder, and we need, as a global world, be able to make sure that we instill this education into the generations in the future, because it can't be just taken for granted that it's going to happen through osmosis.
All right, let me bring in Annika. Annika, I was wondering what your thoughts are today and how much interest or concern there is in the world today about what happened 75 or more than 75 years ago.
Well, I think that really depends on where you look at in the world. I teach at a university here in the United States, and I can say that there's a continuing interest in the history and memory of the Holocaust across the board. My lecture class is usually very well attended. We have a very successful first-year program of students who study the Holocaust for basically a year and then go on a trip to Europe. So I think, especially among young people, there is a continuing interest. But of course, I'm also talking about college students. So I think the wider population, I think we just heard in the last few days that many people don't actually know how many people died in Auschwitz and other areas that were under German occupation and kind of the site of the Holocaust. So I think there's definitely disparities in terms of which part of the population you look at in the United States. And I think that's true for other countries in the world as well. I know the German situation quite well. I was born and raised there, moved to the United States only about a decade ago. So I think it really varies. It often depends on the kinds of schooling that people are able to access. And also I think a lot of what is happening in the families and to what extent people are encouraged to look at problematic aspects of national histories, but also in some cases, family histories.
Tell us about this program that you teach at university. I understand you teach it to first-year students, and as you pointed out, you also go on a trip to Europe. I mean, do you teach them the literature of people who came out of the Holocaust, people like Primo Levi and Hannah Arendt, for instance?
Both. I teach this together with my colleague, Professor Erin McLaughlin. She's in the German Literature and Languages Department at Washington University here. And so the students take a class with me in the fall semester, typically on the history and memory of the Holocaust, and we really try to get a good sense of the development of the Nazi movement in the 1920s, kind of the origins of race thinking, racism, anti-Semitism, and then delve deeper into kind of the institutional development of the Nazi regime and how it essentially prepared over time, not necessarily systematically from the beginning on, a genocide. And so kind of try to get a good sense of the different ways in which the Holocaust happened in different parts of the European continent. looking, for instance, very specifically at the differences between experiences among Western European Jews or Jews who lived in the German-occupied Soviet territories, where the genocide happened in a very different way than in other parts of Europe. But then in the spring semester, they take as a seminar with Professor McLaughlin on the literature and film of the Holocaust, thinking more about representations, which is, as you said, how most people at this point actually access knowledge about the Holocaust. And so they kind of learn to critically relate to these products of film, popular film, graphic novels, fiction, but also survivor memoirs like of Primo Levi. And then at the end of the academic year, we traveled to Germany, Poland, and Lithuania to visit sites that were very relevant, both for the kind of institutional preparation of the genocide. So we look at perpetrator sites in Berlin. Then we also move on to Sachsenhausen, the concentration camp, one of the first concentration camps in Nazi Germany. Then we move on to Poland to visit the town of Oswiecim and the campsites in Auschwitz, and then end our trip with a visit to Treblinka and finally to Vilnius, where we kind of look at the territory of the former ghetto and one of the major execution sites in Eastern Europe in Ponary.
Okay. Anna Scanlon, looking back at what happened, taking us back to the time when the Holocaust took place, how much awareness was there in Europe at the time about what was going on?
I think it depends about who you're talking about when it comes to awareness. Definitely the President of the United States, Winston Churchill, they were all very aware of this. They had meetings about it. When it comes to awareness of people in towns in Germany, when you look at camps that are different from Auschwitz, when you look at camps that were more labor camps where people were walking through the streets to get to work and things like that, I mean, how could you, a lot of older German people will say nobody knew what was going on, but how could you not know what was going on when you saw people who weighed 60, 70 pounds with their head shaved in rags? How could you not know that something was happening? And when it comes to the Jewish population, as far as how well was this kept a secret, when you read testimonies and things like that, actually when you go back to even the diary of Anne Frank, she talks about how BBC Europe, which they were listening to in secret in the attic, had talked about how Jews were possibly being gassed. I think at that point it might have been more of like a rumor. So she said the BBC says that Jews are being gassed. So if this girl that's living in hiding hundreds of miles away from Auschwitz knows about that, I would think that it would be a pretty well-known thing at the time, but it is harder to say.
Michael, that's an important question, isn't it? Who knew what at that time and what the kind of response was? Because we do know that there was a Polish government in exile that had informed the United States, for one, and other allies of what was going on in these camps.
That's right. And of course, we were also in the middle of a war.
Yeah.
So that was, of course, these were tough decisions. And I think, of course, in retrospect, the Allied forces could have done perhaps more. There's no doubt. But I also think it's important to see who were the actual perpetrators, and that, of course, were not the Allied. The Allied forces, and all of them, were the ones who liberated, in the end, the few people who still were able to survive. And we shouldn't forget that many of the survivors actually died after they were liberated, because they were in a terrible situation. They were so weak, they were sick. They were often given, there was goodwill by the soldiers, but they were given the wrong nutrition often right after they were liberated, because they hadn't really taken in real food for years. So some of them died after liberation. And then there were those who survived and never came and never really made peace with the fact that they were the only ones of their big families that survived, and they couldn't live with that either. So it wasn't over on May 8th, 1945. And actually, if I look at the survivors who are still around today, many of them, it's still there. You hear it in their dreams, and you feel it is something that occupies them until this very day very much.
Evan, you talked earlier on about awareness right now, and I think you referenced the same commission that I looked at, a survey rather. This survey was commissioned by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany in 2018, and it pointed to a serious lack of knowledge by Americans. 41% did not even know what Auschwitz means, and others said that only 2 million people were killed, when we know that more than 3 times that number were killed in these extermination camps.
I think it speaks also to, we're seeing now the rise of anti-Semitism in America. I think one of the things that put the cap on dramatic, increases in anti-Semitism in the United States was post-Holocaust America. You had survivors that were in part of our society. Also, there was, I think, a shame by not only the United States government, but also by governments abroad about what took place and how little effort was done to prevent the Holocaust from happening. And I think now, as you get farther and farther away, 75 years now after the liberation of Auschwitz, I think it's showing that as these numbers are dwindling and the knowledge is dwindling, you're also now seeing the increase, dramatic increase in the number of anti-Semitic incidents and anti-Semitic tendencies in our own country, and clearly what's taken place in Europe now over the last 10 years, where we feel it's as bad for Jews in Europe since the end of the Holocaust. And I think as things are, again, as time goes on and the Holocaust becomes more of a distant memory and just a lesson in history that's either taken in or not taken in, you're seeing now with that uncapping of anti-Semitism how society is changing towards its Jewish populations, and it's incredibly disturbing.
Annika, Germany has taken full responsibility for this crime against humanity, and there was a gathering of world leaders in Jerusalem last week. The German president was there. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
The industrial mass murder of 6 million Jews, the worst crime in the history of humanity, it was committed by my countrymen. Germany's responsibility does not expire. We want to live up to our responsibility. By this, dear friends, you should measure us. And I wish I could say that we Germans have learned from history once and for all. But I cannot say that when hatred is spreading.
So, Annika, Germany has some pretty tough laws to combat anti-Semitism, but we also see in Germany the rise of right-wing groups. We see a political party like the Alternative for Deutschland, and it's been making gains in the country. What is the country doing to combat that?
What are they doing to combat that? I think at this point it's more an attempt to manage the presence of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. Because I think the decades in which the fight against anti-Semitism or against the denial of Holocaust memory was essentially in the form of what in the United States would be called hate speech laws, to kind of prohibit the use of particular symbols or particular language. And it turned out that that wasn't very effective. And I think in part, and I've learned in this case very much from my American colleagues and just from living in the United States, is that probably wasn't necessarily conducive to promoting a democratic consciousness. So shutting off conversations wasn't necessarily productive. So at this point, I think the German political landscape is much more caught up in attempts to manage the influence of the AfD, and they're gaining more and more support among the population. Because, of course, they draw on existing biases and prejudices and anti-Semitism that has always existed in German society. I think what is new is that it is publicly articulated in this way and with this force. And through that, of course, also makes it much more possible for other people to repeat similar statements and so forth. So for right now, I don't actually see a very concrete effort or very concrete possibilities really to cut down on this anti-Semitism. It's more managing the political influence of the party, of the AfD. And that remains to be seen whether that is going to be successful or not, because as you know, the AfD gained a lot of votes in several states and in recent regional elections.
Anna, do you think there are sufficient safeguards in place? Do you think enough is being done around the world, especially when we see rising anti-Semitism, rising right-wing nationalism, or does the world have to be constantly vigilant against this type of thing?
I think the world has to be constantly vigilant because as Jews, we know that anti-Semitism always exists, and we have these periods of time that seem to be a golden era, and we seem to think, or at least non-Jews think, oh, you know, anti-Semitism is gone. We don't have this problem anymore. We're more enlightened. And then we go back into the era of anti-Semitism again. And you even look at, you know, the interwar period in Germany between World War I and World War II.
Yeah.
That was quite liberal, and there wasn't, you know, a lot of anti-Semitism, and Jews and gays and lesbians were, you know, integrated into society. Probably, I mean, we can't overstate that and make it sound like it was, you know, all sunshine and lollipops and everything was fantastic, but it was, you know, an era that was very enlightened. And if you were to, you know, take a crystal ball and say that this Holocaust is going to happen in 10, 20 years, it would be almost, you know, completely, you would be baffled to hear that. So I think as Jewish people, we're always aware that this is, you know, that our glory days in the sun are always on a timer, basically. So I don't think that this is anything that is new to us, and it is, you know, are there appropriate safeguards in place? I mean, how do you put them in place? That's kind of the question now, without damaging people's celebrities. So.
Okay, Evan, I've got about a minute left, but I do want to get to this, and this is about the rise of extreme right-wing groups in the United States. The Anti-Defamation League recorded almost 2,000 anti-Semitic attacks in 2018. That's just in 2018 alone.
Yeah, the numbers are staggering. They're some of the highest numbers we've seen since we've been polling since 1979, and we've seen a rise of white supremacist activity, especially in certain parts of the country. The amount of flyering that we're seeing, the recruitment of the lone wolf. If you look at Pittsburgh and Poway, those are lone wolf individuals that got activated online through chat rooms with other white supremacist ideological thinking individuals. And I think it's really a scary time, because now the groups that we saw, or what we saw in Charlottesville with that kind of gathering, is not going to happen again. It's going online, and people are getting recruited there.
All right. And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. We want to leave you with these images marking 75 years of Auschwitz's liberation. Thanks for being with us.